Good morning and welcome to Rising. Got an incredible show for you today. Briahna, what do we have?
Well, Team Rising is going to weigh in on Joe Manchin's blitz across the aisle on abortion. And Katie Halper will discuss the tragic murder of Al Jazeera's Shireen Abu Akleh. Plus, we'll discuss the latest on crypto dips with Liz Wolfe.
But first, yesterday, Dr. Anthony Fauci and other members of the NIH testified on President Biden's 2023 budget request for the agency at a House Appropriations Subcommittee hearing. Now, Fauci was questioned on the impact of the lockdowns that we know contributed to an increase in mental health issues for young people, drove alcohol and drug use through the roof, and all sorts of other social ills. The Washington Post reports that in 2021, more Americans died from overdoses than ever before, up 15% from 2020. Over 100,000 lives were lost to overdoses, meaning the epidemic has now claimed 1 million lives in the 21st century. Now, when asked about the correlation between lockdowns and mental illness, here's what Fauci had to say.
During the times of the lockdowns, the data that we have seen following these lockdowns has shown that we have had increases in depression among young people. Suicide.
There's no doubt that when you
yes or no, if you could just...
I'll answer the question. There's no doubt when you put restraints on society that it causes emotional and mental stress. There's no doubt about that. But you have to have a balance of saving people's lives from getting infected in hospitalizations.
Would you agree that suicide rates have increased among young people?
Indeed, they have.
Would you agree that domestic violence rates have increased?
Yeah, well, the answer is yes, but I'm wondering what that has to do with the question you're asking me.
Would you agree that drug and alcohol use increased during these lockdowns?
Well, I'm not sure the lockdowns itself did it, and I'm wondering why you're asking me about lockdowns, because there were not complete lockdowns in this country.
Right, and he goes on to say that, well, China, those are the ones really locking people down, which, okay, sure, yes, what China is doing is crazy compared to even what we did, but, like, kids were kept out of school for an entire year in some places, or for more. Young people were very locked down. Their entire social lives were shut down. Their sports, extracurricular activities, their social lives were very much shut down by government policy. So he's clearly, he got what the thrust of those questions were. It's to make him look bad for having supported such policies, but he deserves that because he did support such policies.
Well, for one, I think the distinction he's trying to make between what happened in China, which was a real lockdown, people not being permitted to leave their homes, and what was happening today, that's a meaningful distinction if we're asking the question, were people able to make have the certain degree of social interaction? In China, the answer might be no if you're literally unable to leave your home. In America, not being able to go to school or having your workplace closed meant that people could choose, using the freedom that exists in America, to meet up with people and meet up with their friends outside of school and things like that. And to the extent that people chose not to, I think it was in large part because there was a global pandemic. Remember, the year before the vaccine, when you got sick, you could get really, really sick, and many young, healthy people were going to the hospital and even dying. We have 1 million people who have died from this. So I think it's worth making that distinction because while some onus is on the government, there is also onus on individuals for also making the same decision the government did and deciding it was safer to stay at home and deal with the mental health consequences of that than go out and potentially getting a life-threatening illness. Now, I'm with you that some of the COVID recommendations that happened, especially post-vaccine, weren't well calibrated to what the actual risk profiles were of different populations. But I don't think that Fauci is entirely wrong there to want to make some specific distinctions between both what happened in here and what happened in China and what degree of caution and kind of shutting down social life was because of government recommendations or schools being shut down, and how much was because Americans were living through a stressful time and chose to self-quarantine because they didn't want to get a virus.
But the kids did not get you say, okay, they could still see their friends, I guess, but so much of their lives is structured around school, which was the thing that remained closed of all sectors of our society. The thing that was shut down, lightly locked down to some capacity, the longest or restricted, was schools, which makes no sense whatsoever because the school-age population is the least at risk. There's some risk still, sure, but less so than the general population. Many people went back to work or were working the whole time. But the schools were almost universally more closed than anyone. And no one, if Fauci objected to that, he didn't start complaining about it until the very end, until it was too late.
Well, okay, I completely grant that some of the school policy was not well calibrated. I also have a lot of friends with young kids whose kids are preschool age who very much did lament that they weren't able to take their kids to play dates, et cetera. And that wasn't because play dates were shut down by the government. It's because all the other parents decided it wasn't worth the risk, or they formed very small pods with just a couple of other families so they can continue those kind of behaviors. But schools aside, and I grant you some points there, he's talking about the opioid epidemic. Certainly there are some high school students that engaging in drug use, but I suspect a huge population of the folks who were, taking more drugs and suffering from overdoses during this period, they were adults. There are people who are well out of school age who are suffering with addiction. And I think that we have to have, I think it's fair to have a conversation about the trade-offs. We were talking about this yesterday. The trade-offs that are going to occur when there is a government policy trying to stop a pandemic and all the other downstream effects. And we should be having a fulsome conversation about what was worth it and what wasn't worth it. But to pretend like there aren't going to be some negative consequences of the kinds of interventions that are necessary to shut down a pandemic, I think is perhaps a little strong.
Yeah, well, we just have a lot of questions about how much good those interventions did, and now when we're considering, yes, the increase, the things we're talking about. The increased crime, right? The car, even in D.C., the carjackings that are going on, the really antisocial incidents that are, by and large, to my understanding, being committed by young people.
Well, crime in 2020 was down, if I recall correctly.
No, it's going up.
In 2020, the year of the pandemic,
it
everyone
measures
was
how
inside.
Right.
Nobody did anything.
Some categories of crime are going down.
Lockdown.
Some categories of crime are going up, but the trend is not good. The broad, crime decline that began in the early 1990s, that then a massive decline over the next 10 years, and then a continued decline, is starting to go back the other way.
Well, that's a much bigger conversation to be had with a lot of statistics that are not at our fingertips right now. But with respect to Fauci, after that he was asked about his continued pause on gain-of-function research. Let's watch.
Do you advocate for a continued pause of gain-of-function research, sir?
I think it's very important, Congressman, to make sure that we abide by the set guidelines of the conduct of research. One of the problems with the word gain of function, it means so many different things to different people. So what we have done, and we're very, very flexible in re-looking at those guardrails, that when you're doing work on different pathogens, there have been a multi-year process that have set the guardrails of doing that. And those guardrails have worked really quite well.
He also gave a flat-out no when asked if he was responsible for swatting the lab leak theory in the first place in early 2020.
Moving on, when the prospect of a lab leak from Wuhan gained traction in April of 2020, Dr. Collins told you that you should find some way to, quote, put down this very destructive conspiracy. We also understand that Dr. Collins emphasized that the lab leak theory could damage science and international harmony. Did you direct letters to two professional journals be written, The Lancet and Nature Medicine?
No.
You did not ask Daszak to write the letter to The Lancet?
No.
Did you review it before it was sent?
No.
I yield back.
Yeah, so I don't have any insight into whether or not he directed the letter, but it seems like the questioner certainly believed that to be the case.
Right. Well, we've heard, those calls they had about, this is a conspiracy, and how do we? And then they were people should look back at Ryan's previous reporting on this for greater context. But there was some indication that health officials were going way too far to shut down discussion of the lab leak theory. And, as for the gain of function stuff, it's just it's very irritating when he tries to define it in such a way, no, that's not what we're talking about. But that is what we're talking about. That's don't try to play that game. We have serious concerns about the research that was funded by the U.S. government, done in lab conditions that we don't believe, that we know were not totally safe, regardless of whether that is the origin of this disease. And the people have a right to be concerned and even outraged about that. And they don't want, the scientists, the public health officials, the Fauci type people don't want to be subjected to this scrutiny. They fight transparency. They don't want anyone to say you can't tinker with this, you can't toy with Frankenstein's monster because it might come to life and kill us all. But they're scientists. They don't want those kinds of limitations imposed on them. And it's a sleight of hand for him to say it's not gain of function. We're talking about different things. Sounds like gain of function to me. Fine. We'll call it something else if you like. But that thing we don't really want done anymore.
Yeah, I do remember I interviewed Thomas Frank around the time that we were just starting to be allowed publicly to talk about lab leak theory.
Right. Banned on, you get taken down on Facebook if you said the words.
Yeah, and one of the facts of how it all played out that was most damning to me was that in the initial blitz of reporting about how it couldn't possibly be lab leak theory, then that would have this like socially detrimental effect if people believed it were lab leak theory. The person cited in all of the mainstream articles had a relationship in funding one of the labs. And those kinds of conflicts of interest make it very difficult to have long-term credibility in kinds of institutions and these kind of people who are at the same time supportive of shutting down different kinds of speech and like flat out bans of discourse in these kinds of areas. So it's frustrating for sure.
Well, later on in the hearing, the acting NIH director, Lawrence Tabak, told the committee that federal law allows royalty payments to the NIH, but agreed that it gives the appearance of a conflict of interest in response to a question about endorsing particular medicines. When asked about a Chinese request to hide the early COVID genes, here's what the director had to say.
There's no question that the communication that we had about this sequence archive, sequence read archive, could have been improved. I freely admit that. If I may, the archive never deleted the sequence. It just did not make it available for interrogation.
So you have the information?
We have the information.
So it wasn't, the way it was reported is it was pulled out, the early genomic sequencing was removed by a Chinese researcher.
So anybody who submits to the sequence read archive is allowed to ask for it to be removed, and that investigator did do that, but we never erase it.
Oh, so you don't have the information anymore?
We do. We never erase the information. We keep it.
So they were able to withdraw public viewing of it?
Public viewing, that's correct.
It's not erased. We just hid it at request of the Chinese.
Yeah, I
Great. Oh, that's so much better. Wonderful.
Yeah, and for background, what is what we're talking about here? The sequencing for the COVID gene?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Meaning that the argument here is that they had it and this is the lab leak, the basis of lab leak theory.
Yeah. It's just it's the lack of it's the lack of transparency. It's the contempt for people who have sincere questions about what they were doing. That they are just they clearly don't want to answer them. They hate being hauled before these. Fauci has this defiance about him every time he is deigns to have to answer questions from the elected representatives about this. And I find this entire attitude infuriating. Like, they should work for this is an unaccountable bureaucracy with now massive power over our lives, to dictate literally which direction you walk down the grocery store is a power they have claimed for themselves. And they hate being subjected to any amount of democratic accountability. Forget democratic accountability. They're not at all accountable to that. But to even a bare minimum of transparency and asking questions that we have, they hate doing it, and it comes out in their tone every time they're forced to.
All right, Robby, tone policing.
Is that what I'm doing? Is that tone policing? All right. Well, I look forward to your radar coming up next.